I'm sure everybody understood that. Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I'll be spending my time with the member from Richmond Hill today. Mr. Speaker, I am very honoured to stand here today to support Bill C-16, which aims to amend both the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code to add gender identity and expression to the list of prohibited grounds for discrimination. Canadians rightly expect their government and their laws to respect their fundamental values. It is something Canada does very well on so many fronts, but we all know that we can do better. I am very pleased to be here today to talk to you about why I believe this bill does a great service to Canadians by bringing our current legislation more in line with some of the values we hold very dear. We as Canadians are so fortunate to live in a country that embraces diversity. We see diversity as a strength and are rightly proud to celebrate those from all walks of life who contribute to the Canadian tapestry and our society. We also know that diversity in the society did not happen by accident. The extension and protection of rights has been a work in progress for more than half a century. And the two items we are here to discuss amending today, the Canadian Human Rights Act and the hate speech section of the Criminal Code, are fundamental to that work. The changes proposed today are another step towards our goal of a society free from bias and discrimination, where every Canadian is valued and protected. The Canadian Human Rights Act, in conjunction with human rights legislation provincially and territorially, have played and continues to play a fundamental role in ensuring Canadians, regardless of sex, race, religion, sexual orientation, or other prohibitive grounds, can participate fully and equally in all aspects of Canadian life. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, we know that trans and gender-diverse persons have been and continue to be disproportionately impacted by discrimination and hate crimes. And this, Mr. Speaker, is quite simply unacceptable. We can and we must do more to ensure gender-diverse Canadians are free from discrimination and protected from hate propaganda and hate crimes. Bill C-16 is critical in addressing the very real and dangerous discrimination faced by gender-diverse and transgender individuals. I would first like to speak about the amendments this bill would make to the Canadian Human Rights Act. The Act is crucial in ensuring that Canadians have equal opportunity to live, work, and carry out their daily lives without discrimination. But it is not working for everyone. In a 2010 survey of 500 transgendered individuals in Ontario, 13% of respondents indicated that they had been fired, and 18 were refused employment based on their transgender status. Mr. Speaker, again, this is unacceptable. By adding gender expression and gender identity to the list of prohibited discriminatory grounds, we make sure that all Canadians, regardless of their gender identity, have equal opportunities to participate in every facet of Canadian life. Inclusion of gender identity as prohibited grounds for discrimination is much more than just words on paper. It provides individuals with a complaint access to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. It provides individuals with a fair and comprehensive process to ensure the protection of their rights and an opportunity to redress in cases where those rights were not respected. It is my steadfast belief that when we extend and protect the rights of some Canadians, we do a great service not just to those individuals, but to all Canadians. Respect for human rights is so fundamental to who we are as Canadians that whenever we can act to do better, to protect and enshrine rights in this country, we have a duty to do so. Bill C-16 also makes important amendments to the Criminal Code to add gender expression and identity to the list of distinguishing characteristics of an identifiable group and ensure greater protection from hate speech and crimes motivated by hate. The same survey that I referenced earlier found that 20% of transgender individuals who responded had been physically and sexually assaulted, with far too many of these crimes being reported to police. Mr. Speaker, violence and hateful propaganda must never be tolerated in a fair and peaceful country like Canada. But when those crimes are motivated by hatred of specific or identifiable groups of persons, it is incumbent upon us to do more to protect those targeted individuals and hold the people accountable for their actions. The amendments to the Criminal Code proposed in this bill provide increased protections for gender-diverse individuals and permit for longer sentences in cases where the crime has been motivated by bias, prejudice, or hate. Mr. Speaker, we are under no pretenses that the changes in this bill will end all discrimination against transgendered and diverse populations. But it is an important step, one which builds on the advocacy work of those in the LGBTQ+ community and allies, and they have done so for many years. So I am proud that the Government of Canada is now catching up. These changes put in place fundamental protections needed to ensure basic level protection. There is more that we can do, and we must ensure equity for gender-diverse Canadians, but it starts with ensuring their inclusion in the Criminal Code. Mr. Speaker, on a personal note, it is particularly important to me to speak today on this bill because as a Black person and as a woman, there have been periods in Canadian history when people who look like me were not viewed as persons. And during Women's History Month, and in particular today on Persons Day, it is important to recognize this. I am a generation removed from those fights, so I recognize that the privilege given to me to serve in this House requires me, again, is my duty to do all that I can to help extend those rights for all. Further, Mr. Speaker, I have 3 children at home, and everything I do, I cannot help but think about how it will affect their lives. So it is important to me that they know that they are growing up in a Canada where same-sex marriage is the law of the land, and this particular bill is a further extension of our values that we hold dear and values that my children, as young as they are, hold very dear. Mr. Speaker, I hope that in 20 years from now, there will be a generation of children for whom the idea of discrimination based on gender identity or any other discrimination is unthinkable. And Bill C-16 is critical in making that a reality. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I would like to commend my colleague, the Honourable Minister of Justice, for her hard work on this file. Her obvious commitment to diversity and inclusion is an example to all of us in this chamber. I want to thank you for your leadership, and I'm very proud to stand with you today in supporting this legislation, and I encourage my colleagues all through this House to do the same. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister for her passionate speech. One of the concerns I have about the implementation of C-16 is based on testimony we recently heard at the Status of Women in our study on violence against women. In this testimony, we heard that in one location, 40% of the women who showed up at the police station claiming to have been sexually assaulted were turned away at the door. How will the government ensure that C-16, if supported, will be rolled out in a way that will take reports of discrimination or violence against transgendered people seriously?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Honourable Member for her question. And I would first like to say that violence on any level is unacceptable. And what this bill does is it ensures that in our legislation there are adequate protections for transgendered individuals. And, you know, I beg to say that when our diverse communities are empowered through legislation, Mr. Speaker, when they know that they have ground to stand on that is actually written in our codes and our criminal code and our Canadian Human Rights Act, they are empowered to be able to say that when they get to that door and they're turned away or they're not treated in a way that respectfully pays attention to their claim, to their injustice, that it allows them to say that they have grounds to stand on and to fight with others who are their allies to ensure that that never happens to anyone else in the future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my honourable colleague from Esquimalt, Saanich Suk, and Bill 6A, who led this fight many years before. Bill 6A taught me a lot because it was in the same-sex marriage debate that Bill 6A's speech on giving young queer kids a sense of hope really struck home. And it made me realize the importance of standing up to vote. And when I said I would stand up to vote for those rights, I was targeted. The diocese and the community region I represent told me that I'd be denied communion in the church that I worked in, that I helped the kids in, that I ran the choir in, that my children stopped going to church because of the attacks from the pulpit. That I was told a press release was sent out by the diocese that they'd have me defeated in the next election if I didn't change my vote. But I believe that the vote of standing up for individual rights was important. And I only tell that story, and I never talk about that time at all, but I tell it here because I have to say that what made me come through that period so strongly was so many religious people said, we believe in gender and gay equality. We believe in caring for each other. And I can say the priests who stopped their cars on the streets who came up and hugged me, the nuns who called me, the ordinary lay people who said, we can be better than being fearful. And I went back into my riding after that period expecting this supposed blowback, and it wasn't there. People said you did the right thing because when you stand on conscience, you always stand on solid ground. I'd like to ask my honourable colleague what kind of message she thinks this bill will send to this next generation of young people who need to be affirmed. And that is the role of what we're doing in Parliament. We're standing up and saying these young people are valued, they're loved, they have a place, and they have a place that's in the heart of the Canadian society. I'd like to ask my honourable colleague what she thinks about the symbolism of what we're doing.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for his testament and his question. And I first want to say that I empathize with him on some of the story that you related. I want to say that when I think about my own children in delivering the speech and standing here before this House and supporting this bill, I think about myself as a mom and the message that I want to send to them about inclusion and valuing people. We are all just people, Mr. Speaker, and when we start to say, well, some things are unacceptable for some people and some things are acceptable for others, but maybe I shouldn't, that's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. And today we take a step forward in making sure that these rights and protections are in legislation, and that sends a message to our young people that when it is time to fight for those who oftentimes cannot fight for themselves, we need to step up. And if we don't step up, I'll be doing a disservice to my own children, but to many other generations of children to follow. And I again, thank you for your question.
Resuming debate.